This week, I need to move away from theory and begin to address the nature of the problem. This deal is getting worse all the time. Before I say anything else, though, I need to identify what ought to be the center of the discussion. Consider this. Ask anyone in modern America, should it be a goal to create a society where women never face sexism or forms of sexual crime? I absolutely guarantee everyone outside of the dark triad personality traits will agree with this. Now, suggest that we should deport all of the men to Indonesia. Do you support this? Probably not. But why? Deporting all the men would create a society safe for women literally overnight. So, where's the disagreement? Well, caring for women is actually a secondary priority. Our first priority is maintaining healthy relationships between men and women. If we deport all the men to Indonesia, it will achieve this secondary goal of caring for women at the cost of the relationship between men and women. And this cost is far too high. Simply put, we need each other. What I hope to show throughout the coming essays is that our culture is moving away from this concept. The second reason I need to establish this goal, that the ultimate goal is maintaining flourishing relationships between men and women, is that I will inevitably criticize goals and ideals that fail to uphold this ultimate goal. We need to be extremely careful about enacting policies to defend women, to uphold the rights of men, or even to encourage godly chastity and virtue, lest these policies tear apart what God has brought together. If this is the goal, then what is the problem? Well, love in contemporary America, including everything from casual interactions through dating, courting, engagement, marriage, parenting, and sexuality through to divorce, is a convoluted disaster. And the sheer number of influences on our culture that have led us to this disaster is overwhelming. So, how did we get here? Take your pick. Now, I will go ahead and list some obvious influences right away. Feminism at its counterpoint in the so-called manosphere, the sexual revolution, the purity culture movement, the #MeToo movement, the rise of online dating apps and social media interactions more broadly, and the intrusion of what we might call queer theory into secular society. Other secondary influences, of course, include our current economic model, and here I'm thinking of Max Weber's Capitalism and the Protestant work ethic, and the material comforts that we've gained from a century of technological innovation, because when life is this easy, we start searching in nooks and crannies for problems to solve. Now that's at least 8 discernible phenomena that have caused our understanding of romantic interactions to change dramatically, so that something we just muddled through at one point is now impossible for anyone to manage. Now obviously, these issues are so numerous and so complex that I cannot possibly address all of them in one go, so I have to address them across multiple essays. In this essay, I want to address the interplay of feminism and the rise of the so-called manosphere. Now, it might seem odd that I'm choosing to address feminism separately from the sexual revolution. Although these two phenomena are deeply intertwined, there is a good case to be made for treating the sexual revolution as a technological shift, not merely a cultural one. And because the sexual revolution also works well as a counterpart to purity culture, I won't be addressing it in this particular piece. Now, let me start with a brief history of feminism in the manosphere and clarify some of the distinctions to be made there. Feminism, first of all, is typically divided into waves. I've heard anywhere between 3 and 5. In my opinion, 3 waves are clearly discernible, and any more than that is redundant. The first wave is associated with the suffrage movements of the early 1900s, which sought to give women the right to vote, This was probably a response to changes in the family structure brought about by the Industrial Revolution. The second wave is associated with the civil rights movement of the 60s, and this is the bra-burning movement. It sought to give women social freedoms, particularly greater freedom to pursue a career and greater legal separation from men, especially daughters from their fathers and wives from their husbands. Now, this is the movement that is typically associated with the sexual revolution, particularly with sexual liberation, abortion, and contraception, which, again, I'm not really going to be touching on so much here. This movement also had two really great achievements, in particular its contributions to the Civil Rights Act and the Equal Pay Act of 1963. The third wave is where we are currently. This wave is usually associated most with the proliferation of technology and women's issues related to the internet. However, where the first two waves had very specific foci, this third wave goes far beyond the bounds of just looking at the internet, and it's rather directionless and all-encompassing, which makes it very compelling because you can pull any number of concerns out of it, but it's also weaker than previous waves in that sense. Historically, feminism should be traced back to the mid to late 1700s. This is especially the case if we're looking at the work of Mary Wollstonecraft and Charles Fourier. This is the point where the question of women as a separate class, or separate from men, came to be accepted, and the question of interactions between men and women was extracted from the question of overall human well-being. Mary Wollstonecraft highlighted the concern that our treatment of women was too similar to our treatment of children, and in response she advocated that both women and children ought to be emancipated, in a sense, from oppressive, controlling structures of male authority. Charles Fourier famously insisted that societies ought to be judged primarily on their ability to benefit and care for women over and above any other consideration. Now, these two works were 1792 and 1816. My point is that the women's rights movement is far older than we typically realize. Now, feminism's values are too complex to break down into a simple list, per se, plus the kitchen sink, but we can highlight some particular categories, if you will. In particular, social issues, political issues, and economic issues. Contemporary economic issues are focused mostly on women's earning potential, including the so-called wage gap and the pink tax. Political issues involve the ability of women to collectively influence the law and legal process. Now, following the creation of women's suffrage, this has focused almost entirely on the question of representation. The cultural issues are the largest single block of these three, but some of the particularly sensitive issues include women's reproductive rights, including the question of contraception, especially hormonal birth control, and access to abortion. There are also social concerns about women's safety, in particular domestic violence, concerns around the sexual mistreatment of women, particularly sexual harassment, assault, and rape, and questions relating to pornography, sex trafficking, and prostitution. Additionally, there is the question of women's access to education and healthy or appropriate limitations on divorce. However, the biggest issue by far that feminism raises is the question of patriarchy theory. The Encyclopedia of Feminism reads, "Patriarchy is the exclusive, universal political structure which privileges men at the expense of women." Now, some have argued that believing in gender equality is the heart and soul of feminism. If you believe in equality, then you are a feminist. I don't agree. In fact, I would argue that feminism depends on patriarchy theory for its existence, and without patriarchy theory, what you have isn't really feminism. And I think this is the case for two reasons. First, if feminism were truly concerned with gender equality, we would see feminist advocacy for the rights of men where applicable. To my knowledge, no such advocacy exists. Second, patriarchy theory dates back much farther in feminism than we typically believe. It is not a recent innovation. So, for example, the earliest example of patriarchy theory that I know of is in the Declaration of Sentiments, which was drafted at the Women's Convention at Seneca Falls in 1848, more than 50 years before the suffrage movement. Now, the term patriarchy itself is not used, but let me quote from the document. "The history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of man toward woman, having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her." Now, recall that definition from the Encyclopedia of Feminism is the universal political structure which privileges men at the expense of women. And that aligns almost exactly with that quote from the Declaration of Sentiments. This belief that all of history should be understood as the oppression of women by men is at best an exaggeration, I'm afraid to say. If we look at history honestly, we should recognize that societies and empires have always oppressed both sexes, albeit in very different ways. Now, the most obvious example of this is that although men and women have been war leaders, women have never been expected to die en masse in war. And if we look back at the 20th century, we're looking at 100 million men who gave their lives? Maybe not that many. Either way, the number is significantly higher. Now, although feminism raises legitimate and harrowing concerns about the ill use of women by men, the fact that these concerns are all raised against the backdrop of a false victimhood mentality, that is, patriarchy theory, this means that feminism seduces, in a sense, millions of women and girls into viewing men as their enemy, and no small number of men as well into supporting those women in this belief. Essentially, we should be concerned about women, but feminism is making it extremely difficult to see clearly what action is really needed and what the problem really is. Now, secondly, feminism has, for the most part, recently provoked a backlash, that is, the manosphere. Now, I should clarify, I'm only using this term for convenience. The manosphere is not generally an accepted term when it comes to these particular movements, but there's really no better term that I know of for referring to all of the different men's rights movements collectively. And unfortunately, a great deal of the scholarly information on the topic of men's rights is little more than propaganda being driven by the overwhelming influence of feminism within academic circles. As a consequence, the manosphere is not often understood very well, and it doesn't help that the collection of men's movements is something of a hodgepodge. Many of these movements will cooperate with each other sometimes, but more often than not, they just end up infighting. Now, the movements within the manosphere can broadly be categorized under three headings: movements that seek to change or fix society, movements that seek to take advantage of society, and movements that seek to escape society. The primary movement seeking to change society is the men's rights movement. This is essentially the counterpoint to feminism. Sometimes you'll hear it shortened to the acronym MRM or MRA, depending on who's using it. The seminal work in men's rights is Dr. Warren Farrell's book, The Myth of Male Power, although the oldest book that I'm aware of is Herb Goldberg's The Hazards of Being Male from 1976. Now, Farrell is a feminist. He was a longtime member of the board of directors for the National Organization for Women, NOW, and he was one of the first PhD candidates ever to write a dissertation on second-wave feminism. His decision to address the social and legal concerns of men was a shock to many, and this decision effectively destroyed his career. Farrell describes a wide number of concerns that are exclusive to men. Among these include that men are far more often victims of violent crime than women, and women who murder men are rarely prosecuted. Women are essentially free to sexually abuse men as they wish, including and up to rape. Domestic violence against men is often ignored, and in many states it is formal policy that the man be arrested in any accusation of domestic violence, even if the man is the clear victim. This is the courtesy of something called the Duluth model. Men have no legal equivalent to abortion and are often deprived of access to their children, which additionally leads to the very serious problem of fatherless homes, though there are, of course, male deadbeats as well. Men are forced to fight in wars, and in the U.S. the draft is an obvious form of sexist discrimination, hence why the Supreme Court has been debating it in recent years. Men have no equivalent protections against genital mutilation for men, that is, male circumcision, although there are questions here regarding religious freedoms relating to Judaism and Islam, of course. There is an obvious sentencing disparity between men and women. In fact, the sentencing gap between men and women is 6 times wider than the sentencing disparity between whites and blacks. Men are exploited for their physical labor. The majority of the homeless are men. Men reflect the majority of suicides, but receive minimal support. Men's suffering, more generally, is typically ignored or excused. And recently, a couple of new issues have entered the discussion, including particularly financial and educational concerns. Right now, young women who are unmarried and without children, and talking about in their 20s here, out-earn their male counterparts by roughly 8%, and this number has been known for, about 10 years now. And men currently account for roughly 40% of all college graduates, which means that there are 50% more women than men who go to college. And this doesn't even begin to address rates of high school dropout. Now, it's true that there are many men within the manosphere who display misogynistic behavior, and I will grant that there are movements that are deeply questionable here. However, the concerns that Warren Farrell has highlighted in his work are very well supported in scholarship. And despite the fact that these problems exist and are well documented, they are largely ignored by society. Now, the second category is the category of taking advantage of society. In particular, here we have the pickup artists, and this is a group of men who seek to reinterpret the sexual revolution as an opportunity rather than a burden. Recognizing that there are many women who are seeking cheap sexual encounters, and many other women who are interested in marriage and will therefore give up sex in the hopes of marriage in the end, pickup artists, or PUAs, try to reorder their lives in order to create as many opportunities for sex as possible. They spend a great deal of time at the gym to shape their bodies and become as attractive as they can. They invest in their careers in order to amass wealth. They buy expensive and attractive clothing. They educate themselves, read books, keep up on social issues, and they practice socializing. with these tools in their toolbox, they engage in social interactions with hundreds or even thousands of women in the hopes that some of those women will give them sex. Now, on the one hand, these men are really doing no real harm. They don't drug the women, they don't blackmail, they don't force, they don't coerce. The women who are sleeping with them are doing this by choice. The men are just really good at convincing women that it's a good idea. On the other hand, the shallow and destructive nature of this pattern for the PUAs themselves as well as their female conquests is blatantly obvious. And I think that this is particularly clear given that the former PUA Roosh V converted to Orthodoxy and abandoned the philosophy entirely. In case you couldn't tell, I think very little of this movement except that it is really trashy and really destructive. Now, this last year has seen media highlighting a number of movements of men that seek to leave society. In particular, the passport bros phenomenon has gained media attention. These are men who are moving abroad to find love with women in third world countries like the Philippines and ultimately marriage. A second movement is the MGTOW movement, MGTOW, that is, men going their own way. The only real rule of MGTOW is that a MGTOW man should never sign any legal agreement with a woman, especially and above all else, marriage. This stems from fears, and legitimate fears, I might add, of the inequities involved in the family court system. Now, MGTOWs will occasionally interact with women. They may pay for sex, engage in one-night stands, but for the most part, they just kind of avoid women. And at the most extreme end, a MGTOW will try to move off the grid and disappear from society, becoming ghosts or monks. And it really should catch our attention that these men are using the language of monasticism for their ideals. Misusing, but even so. Now, we might also here think of the Japanese herbivore men, or the hikikomori, who are social outcasts in Japan. Although these two groups avoid society, I think mostly based on disinterest and not on some sort of moral objection, fear, or bitterness. And, of course, the third phenomenon of men who seem to have abandoned society are incels, or involuntary celibates. These are men who would otherwise be happy to be in a stable romantic relationship, but for whatever reason, they've been unable to secure a partner. Now, it is often the case that incels are mischaracterized as being ugly, cave-dwelling man-babies, and this is true of some. The reality is that a great many incels are just normal guys who maybe suffer from serious psychological health problems, crippling social anxiety, past trauma. There are plenty of incels or MGTOW who have suffered really terrible divorces. And a great many incels are also on the autism spectrum. And the fact that these men are lambasted in the media as failures or dangers only on the basis of their association with 3 mass shootings is kind of an injustice. My point being, in 10 years, potentially tens, if not hundreds of thousands of incel men who never experience physical contact with another human being and have a real lack of social interaction and compassion in their lives, these men have somehow only resulted in 3 mass shootings. Now, these are horrible things, and I absolutely condemn any sort of mass violence of that sort. But the self-control that these men display is actually something I think that we should admire. Now, what all three of these movements that are abandoning society seem to have in common is the view that modern American women are not worth pursuing. Now, common reasons these men will give for this is that modern women no longer cultivate feminine virtues. There are serious problems with our family court system. Women appear to have increasingly unrealistic and objectifying standards for men, often referred to as 666, that is, 6 feet tall, 6-figure salary, and 6-inch member, and the prevalence of obesity. And I think it's safe to say that men who are abandoning society are probably the largest contingent of men within the manosphere. Now, the last few years have also seen a rise in a number of major public figures who are talking about the perspectives of these kind of leftover men. And some of the really big examples recently are the Whatever podcast, the Just Pearly Things podcast, or the infamous, and rightly so, I might add, Andrew Tate. Now, although these public figures appear to have genuine concerns, nobody can deny that at the very least they are earning boatloads of money, profiting off of men's issues and provoking controversy. And I'm thinking today, right now, of the New York Post article, "Making Women Look Dumb is a Disturbing New Podcast Trend." So these kind of public figures, I'm really skeptical about them, and I've kind of avoided making an obvious judgment of whether they're good or bad. And I think that it might be a while before we know for certain whether they're prophets or dangerous false teachers, wolves in sheep's clothing. So, either way, concerning trend here. And by now, I'm quite certain that I've pissed off everybody who's listening to this. So, why does any of this matter? And what on earth do either of these phenomena have to do with marriage? And for this, I need to turn to a recent development in the fields of psychology and sociology, that is, the study of what is called victimhood complex. Now, there are a number of different terms that have been used for victimhood complex, and it's been looked at from a couple of different angles, but the two really big ones over the last few years are PIVO, Personal In-Group Victimhood Outlook, and TIV, or the Tendency for Interpersonal Victimhood. Victimhood is a psychological mindset of being a victim. Victimhood is characterized by identifying as a victim and identifying someone else, and this someone else can be a person, a social class, an organization, or some sort of social force, and identifying this as their enemy. All forms of victimhood lead to a high sensitivity to slights or offenses, a pattern of addressing conflict by complaining to a third party, and cultivating a self-image of being a victim who somehow deserves or demands assistance. Victimhood fosters an attitude of moral elitism, as if being a victim somehow makes an individual worthy of being listened to or gives them a sort of moral authority. And victimhood, most importantly, creates a very strong tendency toward what is called in-group preference. This brings with it an inability to see the wrongs of one's own social group, and a strong tendency to insist that every other social group's, particularly their enemies, must always be wrong unless they agree with the in-group. And I'm going to read a description here of it. PIVO is the belief that one's group is a constant victim persecuted continually throughout history by different enemies. While it entails an element of intergroup threat, PIVO is unique in linking past and present. The historical injustices incurred by the in-group may have taken place centuries in the past, but still impact the attitudes, emotions, and behaviors of contemporary group members through the belief that past enemies are reincarnated in current adversaries. Moreover, the succession of intentional harms against the group throughout its history turns the state of victimhood into a group disposition. The group is being disposed or even destined to be victimized by others. Historical group trauma spreads both vertically, like a stone dropped into a pond, creating an intertemporal construal of the group as an eternal victim, and horizontally, like the ripples spreading outward on the surface of the pond, leading to a perception of other groups as potentially untrustworthy and malevolent. Now think about this. Where do we see this kind of mindset today? Does it perhaps have any bearing at all on the breakdown of marriage and courtship? Which brings me back to my starting point. Feminism is an older movement that has successfully addressed some major justice issues over the past 250 years. However, it is burning out, and the only relevant issues that it addresses now are sex trafficking, prostitution, and the sex industry. Issues, I might add, that don't get nearly enough attention. The only other issues that remain relevant within feminism are those of sexual violence and domestic violence. But these issues affect men nearly as much as they affect women. The ratio is about 3-2, I would guess, women to men. And nearly all of our social resources are exclusively dedicated to women's well-being. I do not say this to diminish the seriousness of sexual violence and domestic violence against women. These issues do affect women more seriously than they affect men. But society often denies outright that these issues affect men at all. Thus, sexual and domestic violence are viewed as women's issues only, when they ought to be viewed as gender-neutral issues. On the other hand, men's issues appear to have more legitimacy and prevalence in society today, but these advocacy movements and social conditions, which are all fairly new, are spawning multiple communities of men who are either treating women very poorly, and here I've got the PUAs very firmly in my sights, or men like MGTOW who are deeply embittered and withdrawing from society. What both the manosphere and feminism share in common is this victimhood mentality. And this is unquestionably leading to an environment of intense animosity between men and women. The fact that the gender war is growing more intense, gathering more people into it, and leading to greater division between men and women is itself a greater problem than any one issue either side could name, and I think perhaps even a greater issue than the whole combined. This is where we need to remember to practice availability, receiving others, and sacrificially loving them. Let us remember Jesus' parable of the speck and the plank. Do not judge, so that you may not be judged. For with the judgment you make, you will be judged, and the measure you give will be the measure you get. Why do you see the speck in your neighbor's eye, but do not notice the log in your own eye? Or how can you say to your neighbor, let me take the speck out of your eye, while the log is in your own eye? You hypocrite! First take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your neighbor's eye. Matthew 7:1-5. Part of the point here is that even if you are the one with the speck in your eye, it is still hypocritical to then turn to the one with the plank in their own eye until you've removed the speck. If you have looked at the gender divide and your immediate response is, well, what you don't understand is, then you're kind of missing the point here. The reality is, when two pigs roll in the mud, it doesn't matter one iota which one of them ends up muddier at the end or which pig rolled first. Even more so, this is the case if those two pigs happen to depend on each other for their survival. So too with women and men. Our responsibility is not forcing one another to behave appropriately, but taking responsibility to clean up our own house and to continually question, are we truly as righteous as we feel we are? Because more likely than not, we judge ourselves much more highly than we ought to. To practice availability in a situation like this requires that we start by asking, what can I do for you? Long before we ask things for ourselves. But what about the... Okay, yeah, I think we can all agree that there are real injustices here that face both men and women. But until we can talk about those injustices without argument, until we can listen with compassion to each other, and until we can conceive of solutions that are mutual, our efforts do not appear to be achieving the optimal outcome, which is reconciling the sexes. Now, I'm well aware this is a lot to take in, so let me repeat that I've got the script for this text, and it includes my citations, although I will admit here that my understanding of feminism is woefully shallow, and I apologize for that. Unfortunately, the reality here is that explaining the problem of courtship and marriage in terms of feminism and men's rights is the tip of the iceberg. Remember, I've still got 6 more topics to go through, and here I am way over length on my time here, and this essay has done little more than skim the surface, and I haven't really talked about solutions. So, better or worse, this is kind of where I'm going to have to close things up and move on. And what I'll be moving on to next week is the topic of the sexual revolution and purity culture, which is going to be part 2 on this trek through the problems of modern dating.